I don't know about you, but for me, one of the highlights of 2022 was watching this pitchfork-wielding maniac lose her shit. There's something about her descent into lunacy that feels equal parts tragic,
all I really want is to be loved,
hilarious,
May I have this dance?
and despite taking place over 100 years in the past, deeply in sync with our modern times. The more I watch this movie, the more I find myself sympathizing with her madness, justifying her murderous impulses, as if I've been sucked into her technicolor nightmare of a reality and assimilated to the perspective of a monster. A monster I can't help but see myself in the longer I stare at it. Let's talk about Pearl and what those unconventional cravings of hers really have to say about the human condition. On the surface, Pearl's premise is pretty straightforward, mostly taking place on a Texas farm where she lives with her paralyzed father and overbearing mother at the peak of the Spanish flu pandemic. Pearl gets it in her head that she's meant to be a dancing star on the big screen. Except there's just one problem. Her mother forbids her from following her dream, diagnosing it as nothing more than a naive young girl's delusion that will inevitably lead to failure. Also, Pearl has a habit of killing innocent little animals. So, two problems, actually. But what adds the first fascinating layer to this character study is that it acts as a prequel to the movie X, where we were first introduced to Pearl in 1979, over 60 years after her movie's story takes place. I don't want to dive too deep into X here, I'll save that for another video, but it's important to touch on the fact that our initial introduction to Pearl is as a very old and very disturbed slasher villain alongside her husband Howard. The plot of X sees Pearl and Howard picking off a group of young and beautiful characters shooting a low-budget porno on their farmland.
Would you like to come inside?
And it's not long before we find these are far from the first gruesome murders this twisted couple has committed on their territory over the years. But what makes Pearl such a standout antagonist in X is her off-putting obsession with that movie's protagonist, Maxine. Mia Goth plays both Pearl and Maxine in dual roles, creating a distorted reflection of these two women who are essentially the same person at opposite times of their lives. Maxine craving fame at all costs while she's still young.
I need to be famous, Wayne. I'm ready for the high life. I'm sick and tired of never getting what I want.
And Pearl, bitter and resentful for having failed at following that same dream in her youth.
we're the same. Wanda just lied to me.
Maxine seeing her greatest fear in Pearl, Pearl seeing her greatest regret in Maxine. X provides us only the faintest backstory for Pearl.
I was a dancer in those early years.
But it's just enough to convey a sense of loss and shattered expectation looming like a shadow over her past.
Not everything in life turns out how you expect.
Maxine reminds Pearl of herself when she was her age, inciting a homicidal rage, but at the same time, a renewed sense of life and vitality she hadn't felt since her youth. As is displayed in the infamous bedroom scene, where Pearl undresses and hops into bed with Maxine, Pearl in some perverse way wants to become Maxine, as if absorbing her youthful essence can reverse time and return her to when her days were ahead of her and possibility was still within reach. Which is what the entirety of Pearl's movie can be viewed as. Pearl and X looking back on the events that made her through an exceptionally brightly colored lens. This would explain why the photographs we see of Pearl and X look similar to, but not exactly like Maxine. Because after encountering Maxine, she's taken by a psychotic episode, and as she mutilates her victims, dances in their blood, and gets a little too close for comfort with this reflection of herself, she feels the urge to both kill and consume. She's reminiscing on her own youth, the beauty and the ugliness of it, with Maxine as her avatar. But having Mia Goth play a young Pearl also works to communicate an ongoing cycle of egocentric delusion brought on by the advent of film. Both Pearl and Maxine are convinced they're meant to be world-famous stars, so much so that their entire sense of self-worth hinges on whether they succeed at this goal or not.
I mean it. I want the whole world to know my name. One day the whole world's gonna know my name.
But on an even deeper level, both characters desire fame as a way of feeling control over their own mortality. To escape the dead-end future of a stripper or the dead-end future of an obedient farmer's wife, the finer details don't really matter, because the desire to be exceptional is the same across time.
You're special. There ain't nobody else out there like you.
I'm special. Mama's gonna feel real stupid when she finds out, won't she?
For as long as there have been screens with celebrities on them, there have always been those undone by the belief that they too can achieve glory, that they too can be immortalized and loved by all.
I will not accept a life I do not deserve.
Because being assigned to a life with a predetermined path can remind us that a slow march toward old age and death is all there is. While the notion of fame appeals to the ego, provides a false promise that there could be so much more to life if we're only willing to believe. Which can lead us to consider, as our world has only become more and more defined by screens and the people finding various levels of fame within them, how many pearls throughout the years have been and will be driven mad from a longing to become the projections on the screens they so adore. I think this is a core aspect of what makes us sympathize with Pearl, because though we see her indulging in her monstrous qualities as abhorrent, we also understand those qualities are a symptom of being forced into a life she so badly doesn't want to live. Pearl is a caged bird, locked in a solitude she wasn't made for, and driven insane from watching so many others flying free from the viewpoint of her window. And the key antagonist of Pearl, the warden to her prison, is her mother.
I did not excuse you from the table. Setz dich.
But why is Pearl's mother so adamantly against her daughter chasing her dream? On the surface, it's because of the harsh circumstances they find themselves in. In a time of war and sickness, they need to be realistic about how they ensure their survival.
Du darfst nicht so leichtsinnig sein. Es liegt jetzt nur an uns, an dir und mir, zu überleben.
But under the surface, she feels an obvious resentment toward her daughter.
Why do you hate me, Mama?
I only want what's best.
We can imagine she was raised in an equally, if not even more strict environment, and the fact that Pearl finds her weeping in her sleep tells us that, despite maintaining a tough exterior, she's unhappy with the way her life has turned out, an unhappiness she projects onto Pearl.
I shoulder a burden you will never understand. You dare sit there and talk to me about regret?
Most tragically, through Pearl's mom, we begin to realize that, despite how hard she tries to avoid it in the present, Pearl will one day become her mother in her old age, resentful for the young and free, and hardened by life's cruel hand.
Why should you get to have it all? What have you ever done except be a whore?
Pearl's mother creates a shadow within Pearl. Her drive to succeed as a dancer is fueled by the part of her psyche that believes her mother is right, that she isn't special. Pearl lives in a world of repression and isolation. She's assigned the duty of pleasing her parents and staying faithful to her husband Howard while he's away fighting the war, all the while bottling up the parts of herself that stand in opposition to those standards. Her lust for other men and desire to chase fame are sinful and therefore must be concealed. Pearl shows us the maddening results that come from conditioning people to hate the sin within them, to suppress the uglier side of themselves, and project a facade of surface-level normalcy. The halfway point of the movie is when this all comes to a head, when Pearl's pent-up darkness finally erupts out of her. Setting her mother on fire and leaving her to die in the basement. And abandoning her helpless father to sleep with the film projectionist she's been flirting with up to this point. Pearl becomes guided fully by her shadow self, a psychotic need to prove her mother wrong and set herself free that turns the dial on her malevolence higher than ever. On first watch, Pearl's appetite for killing animals can seem somewhat random, like her seed of self-destruction was always just there, waiting to grow wild. But looking more closely, it's clear that killing gave Pearl a feeling of control in a life she never had any say over. Her path was predetermined. Like a helpless animal, she was brought up on a farm where her parents and husband made every choice for her. So killing living creatures whose fate she holds power over becomes her twisted little outlet. Even experiencing a miscarriage became a secret, guilty pleasure.
I never wanted to be a mother. I love the feeling of it growing inside me. I felt like sickness pulling, sucking on me like some needy animal in a barn.
In her own way, snuffing out life became Pearl's art, her merciless expression of how she views existence.
How could I be responsible for another life? Life terrifies me. It's harsh and bleak and draining. I was so relieved when it died.
So when she finally takes her art to the next level by killing people, it's all under the guise of eliminating the obstacles holding her back from freedom.
You are loved.
And while we may be repulsed by the monster we've watched Pearl evolve into, we still hope deep down that she could win the talent audition and leave the farm behind forever. And this is such an essential draw of Pearl's story, because if you've seen X, you already know Pearl's fate. She's destined to stay on that farm until the day she dies. But the moment she walks on that stage with everything at stake, we want to believe she could win, that the future could still unfold in her favor. Maybe in some sense because we want this caged animal to finally know freedom, but perhaps even more so because we want to believe that escaping a bad situation and finding purpose in circumstances where the odds are stacked up against us is a real possibility. We manage to look past the fact that our lead character is a ruthless murderer to find the all-too-human struggle for freedom at the center. And while her excessively over-the-top reaction to being rejected is a bit of comedy gold,
it's gonna be a no.
Please, I'm a star!
it leads us right into the heart-wrenching scene the entire movie has been building up to, the moment when Pearl bears her soul to her sister-in-law, Mitzi. Throughout most of its runtime, Pearl dances the line of being a tongue-in-cheek horror comedy.
What did I do wrong?
Nothing. Calm
No!
down.
Why are you leaving me if I didn't do anything wrong? I don't understand. I thought you liked me!
And a dramatic exploration of mental health deterioration. But in this climactic scene, the scales tip overwhelmingly to the latter. As for almost 6 minutes straight, we're forced to sit with Pearl in all of her pain while she confesses her most personal truths to Mitzi. Her feeling of abandonment from her husband after giving up so much for him.
Why did you leave me, Howard?
Her deeply ingrained inferiority complex.
I'm not pretty, or naturally pleasant, or friendly. I'm not smart, or funny, or confident. I'm exactly what Mama said I was, weak.
But as we descend deeper and deeper into the dark pit of her mind, it begins to feel less like Pearl's talking to Mitzi, and more like she's talking directly to us.
Do people like you ever feel this way? I figure you don't. You seem so perfect all the time.
Suddenly, Pearl goes from a story about the creation of a monster to a reflection of humanity's most concealed qualities. The part of ourselves that doesn't think we're good enough or normal or special in the way we see others so often portrayed in the screens we watch them through.
What is wrong with me? Please just tell me so maybe I can get better. I don't want to end up like Mom, or I want to be dancing up on the screen like the pretty girls in the pictures.
We can't help but identify the self-destructive nature that can come out of the pursuit of perfection. The belief that there's something fundamentally wrong or different inside of you, and desperately wanting to be accepted for anything but that defect.
I want what they have so badly. To be perfect. To be loved from as many people as possible to make up for all my time spent suffering.
But there is no hope for Pearl. We know the destination this tour through her broken psyche leads. Her voice begins to take on that sunken, hollow tone it'll be defined by in her old age.
Mama was right. Never getting off this farm. Y'all was young ones too.
And we realize Mitzi can't make it out of this alive for that grim future to be fulfilled. But most unsettling of all is how cathartic Mitzi's long drawn-out death can feel. We've been emotionally indoctrinated into the mind of a serial killer, been made to sympathize and relate to her innermost human struggles, and by now we've watched her get rejected by everyone she revealed her unfiltered self to.
Why are you leaving me? What did you say? Why did you change?
You're scaring me, Pearl.
I should probably get going now. Mother'll be wondering where I am if I'm not home soon.
There are few fears greater than opening up about the darkest parts of yourself, only to be looked at as something frightening in return. Out of that can come a perverse sense of liberation in embracing the monster you're seen as. As Pearl gets closer and closer to Mitzi, like a shark in the water gaining on its prey, we find ourselves rooting for the shark, knowing that this meal is all the shark has left in its pitiful little life.
I'll do anything you want.
It's not about what I want anymore, Mitzi. It's about making the best of what I have.
And it's hard not to feel an infectious sense of empowerment as Pearl takes that final swing, severing her connection to her dream and embracing the identity she was masking all along. As Pearl disposes of Mitzi's body and props up her parents' corpses around the dining room table, we're shown the grotesque reality of Pearl's mental state, a disgusting yet hauntingly beautiful shrine to the prison she'll forever be trapped in, the first of many horrific masterpieces to come.
Amen.
But if there's any moment that best captures the tone of this movie, it's the ominous credits shot it ends on. Howard returns home, having no doubt experienced his own tour of horrors from the war, to find the deterioration of the home he left behind, and his wife greeting him with one hell of a disturbing smile. But despite the signal that the movie is over, it just lingers, forcing us to sit with Pearl as she holds back a tidal wave of pain. Juxtaposed with a triumphant orchestra playing us out, it initially comes off as a comedic send-off, until the music fades into a far more unsettling score, leaving us with this haunting portrait of untreated illness, rotting and poisoning from the inside. The shot fades with an iris out, a classic film technique typically used to exit a story on a high note. But here, it communicates something deeply sinister, like we're watching Pearl get swallowed by an inescapable darkness. Pearl is a lot of things all at once. It's eerily beautiful, unpleasantly comedic, and intimately terrifying. But at its heart, it's an encapsulation of the destructive human desire for perfection. The movie's vibrant Technicolor presentation is on one hand a throwback to the early days of cinema, when color was first infused into the motion picture experience. But on a deeper level, the painted beauty of this world is only a distraction from the true darkness it conceals. On the outside, the farm Pearl lives on is a colorful dreamscape. But, like Pearl herself, the more we spend time within the internal structures of this land, the more we encounter its dark inner workings. Unlike the films released around the time period its story is set in, Pearl gives an honest look into the facade these almost heaven-like projected reels acted as, and explores the very real trauma from war and isolation that permeated this era. But masking darkness isn't exclusive to the history of cinema. It's a fundamental tool of human nature as well.
It's hard to know who anyone is nowadays with all these masks people are wearing.
Pearl wants to live a life of a star on the big screen to escape the disappointing life she's stuck with. She sees the masks of perfection worn by the people she watches in these imaginary worlds, and wants so desperately to make that her reality. And despite the fact that she's willing to achieve this goal by any means necessary,
If only they would just die.
Pardon?
Nothing.
it's the tragically human thirst for perfection, and to receive an infinite amount of love and acceptance for that perfection that has us wanting to see her succeed at attaining what we all know is ultimately only an illusion of fulfillment. But perhaps it's the conclusion Pearl comes to about herself that makes us really feel for her. The lesson she extracts from her experience isn't that perfection isn't real, or that the fantasy she's been chasing was a deception all along. Instead, she concludes that she's simply unworthy of a better life. Escaping the self-defeating shadow of her mother is what drives both her and our desire to see her succeed. But most disappointingly, the movie ends with her accepting her mother's lesser view of her. Her once damaged sense of self-worth, now completely shattered to pieces. And there's an uncomfortably relatable horror to Pearl's downfall, the fear of attempting with everything you have to succeed at something, only to end up defeated and more damaged than ever by the very same shadow that drove you to reach that success in the first place. Like Pearl, we all have a farm that represents everything about ourselves we hope to escape. And there's nothing more terrifying than the idea of living out the rest of your days on that farm as the monster you always feared you were.
the boys found this inside.
What do you think is on it?
I see one goddamn fucked up horror picture.